Hello and welcome to the third episode of Soul's 2023 webinar series featuring presentations on a range of topics related to ecological land care. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Christine and I'm the Special Projects Lead with Soul. I'm happy to be your host today. I live in Ottawa, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. It would be wonderful to see where you're joining us from, so I invite you to put that information in the chat. Soul's webinar series is held every 2 weeks on Tuesdays at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. Every month we feature a theme, and this month's theme is biodiverse food forests and community gardens. You can find the monthly themes and schedule on Soul's website. And to receive the Zoom link and reminders, please make sure to register through Eventbrite for the individual sessions. At the end of the talk, we will be opening the floor for questions. You can ask questions via the chat function or after the presentation by unmuting yourself and asking the questions directly. Please note that we are recording these sessions and they will be posted on Soul's website at organiclandcare.ca. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this webinar series and much of Soul's work is made possible by the generous and ongoing support of Gaia College, Canada's leading college for professional development and diploma courses in organic land care. Soul is also supported by its members, so if you haven't become a member, I invite you to do so. Finally, for today's presentation, I'm pleased to introduce Ralph Mezenbrink, who is in Guelph, Ontario. Ralph is an active garden volunteer and West Village Community Development Co-op board member. Without further ado, welcome, Ralph. Take it away.
Thank you, Christine. I'll start by giving a little bit of information about myself. I am an immigrant. My parents came to Canada when I was 3 years old. I'm a retired educator and currently a school board trustee. I've been involved with the neighborhood group since 2006, first as a volunteer, and since about 2015 as a member of the board of directors. And I'll start by talking a little bit about the neighborhood group, which runs the garden before we get to the garden itself. So a little bit about the West Village. It started off as a city-funded neighborhood group in the City of Guelph around 1997. We're in a neighborhood that, based on the social determinants of health, is a priority neighborhood, along with several other neighborhoods at the time. We've looked at data and asked how and where we could focus our efforts and resources to make an impact on well-being. And in 2012, we started a long process of community conversations, talking to people at programs, at our community events. We had surveys, sounding walls, all sorts of ways to try and engage with the people who live in the neighborhood to hear what they wanted for themselves and their families, how they wanted to contribute to the overall well-being of the neighborhood. What we heard is that people did not want to be serviced or done to or done for. They wanted to be part of something. They wanted to be valued and not made to feel less than. And a couple of examples that you'll see in our pictures here. The neighborhood group runs a free community fair, a fall fair every year. We typically hand out somewhere between 800 and 1,000 hot dogs that either neighborhood group purchases or that are donated, as well as more recently samosas and various other things. And if that's an indication of the number of people who attend, that is huge. We're in a neighborhood that is physically cut off from most of the rest of Guelph by both a Metrolink rail line to the south and a 4-lane expressway to the east of where we are. And so we're in an area that does not have a grocery store unless you cross one of those boundaries. And we have a lot of high density housing, supported housing, subsidized housing, as well as a lot of rental units. So it's a destination for a lot of new Canadians who come to Canada and come to Guelph. That means to some extent our population is a bit transitory, but also we're dealing with people who are struggling just to make day-to-day ends meet. We did a lot of research. The image you see in this slide here is a timeline of the neighborhood group starting in 1997. The rest is fairly blurry, but we changed how we operated over a period of time. And in 2015, we actually split from a group in Guelph that supports most neighborhood groups because our philosophy was different. We didn't want to be top down, a centralized sort of organization like it seemed that the support organization for the various neighborhood groups was, and we incorporated as a nonprofit and eventually got our charitable status. We have looked at other organizations, both close by, far away. As an example, we researched and talked to the First Nations youth social enterprises in Winnipeg. We have talked to people my wife has talked to people in Italy and so on. So we have tried to get as much information about different ways of doing things as possible. We use a sustainable livelihoods framework. We're committed to change what we do and how we do it by putting the community and the people who live in that community at the center. And we do that without any real consistent funding. My wife, Linda, is good at writing grant proposals, and that is how we get the vast majority of our funding. We do use social determinants of health, the sustainable livelihoods framework, community development efforts. And a good example is this picture here. It is tax season. Our community group does a whole lot of tax returns for people in the neighborhood, mostly people living on fixed incomes or perhaps in poverty, new Canadians. And we see filing tax returns as a poverty alleviation strategy, but we do it differently. Instead of having accountants come in and meet with clients, do their taxes, file them, what we do is we work with members of the community, we train them. We've worked with the Community Volunteer Income Tax Program staff at CRA, who have done some training sessions for us. So in the end, we're training our own community members so that the skills are built in the community and then stay in the community, which long-term helps us and provides skill to members of the community, instead of that skill leaving with the accountant going back to the office. Our neighborhood community garden. This is a picture probably from almost exactly 2 years ago, end of April, beginning of May in 2021. The school you see in the background is St. Peter Catholic Elementary School on Westwood Road in Guelph. There is a huge field, and when students go out to play, they play in the back part. Sight lines are not great to where you see the stake here in the ground. And we worked with the school board. I think our first letter to the school board asking for space was in 2014. It took until 2021 when there was a change of leadership, COVID and various other things came together. We had funding together and we had an actual plan. And I'll show you the plan in a moment, where we worked with a landscape designer who took some of the input we had from members of the community and put together a plan. So when we came to the Director of Education with the plan, funding, the fact we were a charitable organization that's not going away very, very quickly, the answer was, yes, you can use the space. And how do I put this politely? We didn't hesitate. We put stakes in, we put things in the ground, and we started getting going very quickly. And this was all in terms of trying to address the basic needs for food access and food security for people who there are over 1,000 high density housing units within a 10-minute walk where people do not have the ability to grow food on their own property. Here is a Google Map view. The white square or the white rectangle is where the garden is. You can see the school, as well as almost all the housing you see. It's high density rental housing, much of it subsidized, apartment buildings, townhouses. It is only the single family homes in the bottom left and the very top right that are single family homes. The rest of what you see is, as I said, over 1,000 high density units. Here is a diagram. This is not quite what ended up happening, but we'd asked for more land than eventually the facilities people allowed us to have. But we have roughly a 30 by 60 meter or 100 by 200 foot plot of land. We built it in 2 separate phases. The first phase was putting in some gardens. We got permission on April the 23rd of 2021. By June the 1st, we had plants in the ground. So we had to move fairly quickly. And we planned for phase 2 right from the get-go. We had the plots for phase 2 in by September. We had a fence around the perimeter by September. I want to point out a couple of features, but I'll move to our next slide. Here is an aerial view in early spring of last year that shows the garden as a whole. I want to point out a couple of features. There's about a 3-foot wide, what we're calling a food fence around the perimeter. We have a couple of hundred asparagus crowns. We have raspberries, strawberries, sunchokes. I'm probably missing something, some rhubarb. But the intent of that is that this fence provides a bit of a barrier, and that the fence also provides a communal source of food, with the intent that our gardeners who have their own plots will also be looking after this communal garden and can participate or can take part in that harvest. We do have a storage shed, as you can see, right smack dab in the middle. We have a shade structure. We put that up because many of our gardeners do not have childcare and come with 2, 3, sometimes more children with them and need a place. During the middle of the summer, there is no shade, which is great for the plants, not so great for the kids. We have 4 IBC water tanks, about 1,000 liters each, that we fill with about 250 feet of hose from the school next door. That's about the only support other than use of the land that we have from them. You can see next to the IBC tanks, we have a couple of bins. We keep tools, hand tools, trowels, and watering cans there. We have not locked them up. We have lost 1 of 16 watering cans in a 2-year space of time. So we are relatively happy with that so far. You can see the fence around the outside. The fence, we worked with the school board to see what they would need in terms of safety and so on. They really hadn't thought about a community garden on school board property. So we put up a section, said, how does this look? They said, fine. We went ahead and built this. The fence has about 600 cedar posts, a 36-inch high fence around the outside. That's not enough to keep people from jumping over, but having looked at other community gardens, the reality is a fence is not going to keep out anybody who really wants to come in. So we don't lock our gates, unlike some other community gardens. Yes, we have had some theft, but we've also seen other community gardens in Guelph that have had sheds burnt down, tools stolen, and various other things. We think the best way to avoid that is to make sure that there are people here almost all the time and that people know it's part of the community and value it. So gates are unlocked. You can see that we have 4 off to the left-hand side. We have 4 raised gardens, 2 at about 22 inches high, 2 at about 30 inches high. Last year, 2 of them were used by people who needed them. 2 were used by others. We have a waiting list. Our garden plots, each one of those plots is 10 feet by 20 feet or 3 by 6 meters. There is a community herb garden just above the shed in your view. And down below, the strip of dirt that has 4 marks where we've recently watered. That is Three Sisters Garden that one of our Indigenous gardeners had put in. Each of the plots is available for free, depending on the size of the family and the ability of people to maintain. Some people will have a full 10-foot, 20-foot plot. Some people will have a half, and some people will have a quarter. Last year, we had, I think, 72 families and about 205 people who were eating from their garden. You'll notice there's a fair bit of green space. That's intentional. This is a school property, and we do every day when the weather is nice in the late spring and early fall, have multiple classes come through. And when you have 30 some odd kids walking through, if it was a 1-foot wide path, we'd have a lot of damage to the plots themselves, and this certainly avoids that. And on top of that, in many ways, this is a social space. Although there is a park next door, the reality is that the park is mostly sports fields with a playground, so there's not a whole lot of gathering space. And when people come here, there's also an opportunity to socialize as one member of the family might be tending the garden. Somebody else might be watching the kids or having a chat or visiting somebody else. We've had sharing of produce and so on. We are quite happy with what has happened so far. At the front, on the left-hand side, large opening, we do have a 10-foot wide, one of those posts is removable, 10-foot wide lift-off gates so that we can have compost or so delivered directly inside the garden. Not sure if I've missed anything else here. A couple of features. I mentioned the food fence, the shed for storage, the shade structure, the 4 tanks, tools always available, wide pathways. We do have a number of people with disabilities, but the majority of them do not need the raised bed because we've made the paths wide enough that they can use a walker or so to get around. As I mentioned, fence and gates, not locked, relatively low fence. Keeps dogs out, keeps rabbits out, I'm hoping. And but beyond that, if somebody wants to jump it, they're going to jump it. It is on school property, so there are no pesticides, only compost. We are not allowed to compost on site, which is something we'll work with the school board on over a period of time. The closest portion of the school next door is actually a porta pack and does not have, it's basically a portable with brick veneer on the outside. They've had rat problems in the past. I know that if you compost correctly, we won't have rat problems, but it's not me. We have to convince, and the reality is if that's the cost of doing it, so be it. We often have classes visits. We've had some issues with the first year a class had a garden and it was great until the end of June, and then there was nobody to take care of it over the summer. Meanwhile, we had a waiting list of families who wanted to grow their own food. So there's a bit of frustration there, but we're working through that. There is no cost to gardeners. Cost is a barrier. Even $5 or $10 is a barrier to people living in poverty. If we provided seedlings the first couple of years as well, we will probably do the same again, because as a family, that is a risk. Do I spend $10 on seedlings and seeds or so, or do I spend the $10 on food that I know my kids will eat? And there's no guarantee of a harvest either. So there is a risk portion of that. We are part of the City of Guelph's Community Garden Network, which is really an information sharing network. The only thing that the city provides for us is, you saw the wood chips around the paths, around the edges of our gardens. They provide that for free to any community garden. And I have a video I'd like to show. This video shows, it was taken with a drone, and there are 2 pieces joined together. There are shots taken in, I believe, May of last year, as well as, I think, July. I can't remember the exact timing, but certainly you can see the difference. Sorry, I thought I'd included another screen or another slide, but that's fine. In 2022, we had 72 families, 205 adults and children who were gardening and eating from that. Our focus for the future. We are set up intentionally as a cooperative, and we want to work with our gardeners to create both leaders in each group of 5 or 6 plots. We hope to have a leader that can provide advice, be a connection to the board of directors and so on. And we're trying to grow skill, grow that sharing, and also to deal with things such as potential theft and vandalism by making sure that our gardeners know each other, that they are not afraid to say, hi, my name is such and such, I don't recognize you, do you have a plot here, and so on. And that's been a bit of work, but we want to build emerging leaders. We want to build that decision making. We hope that this year we can start to move into the situation where our gardeners work together, that we give them a budget, and then they can decide what the garden needs in terms of tools or various other things. So trying to build that decision-making and political engagement, if you want to call it that. And I think that's about it in terms of my presentation. I am happy to answer questions.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. That's, well, amazing presentation, but also just the visuals. I think most of us got a very strong sense of what it looks like and how sort of abundant it is. The growing season last year, I guess, when the photos were taken, that's a big accomplishment, a big crop. And as you say, it's fed 70 plus families and multiple people. So yeah, very impressive.
If I may add to that, we ended up putting out baskets every Tuesday near the shed and collecting excess produce. Our neighbor group also runs it's called a hub and spoke model with the local food bank, where they deliver to our office, which is relatively close to the garden. And then people who live in our part of the city don't have to cross the Hanlon or take a taxi to the food bank, but rather can come close by. And it's a market sort of thing where you get so many points a month, depending on family size, and you choose what you need. But fresh produce is always something we need. And we probably had hundreds of pounds of tomatoes, lettuce, kale. For the most part, those are probably the most abundant crops. But one thing we are working with an experienced gardener with this year is trying to run some workshops on how to organize and plant a garden, because people who hadn't gardened much before put all their little tomato plants too close, too many, because they're so tiny when they get planted, and then all of a sudden they've got more tomatoes than they know.
Yeah, everyone has a lot of tomatoes. All right, well, I have a question, but I also would like to invite people, if they do, to either put the question in the chat box, that feature that we have, or signal that you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly. But let me just start, because I think it's always interesting to know what a presenter who's part of one of these gardens and green spaces, what is the key motivator? What do you get out of this personally, or what drew you to this work, this involvement, community engagement, and community development project? What drew you to this, and what are you mainly getting out of it, inspired?
Probably what drew me to it is a number of things. One of them is the fact that European background, but when my family came to Canada in 1965, I remember my family struggling financially. And then once they did buy a house, we always had a garden in the backyard where we grew food, not as much as some other people, but certainly that was always important to us. My extended family in Germany always had, I'm not sure what, there's a name that I can't think of right now in German, Kleingarten, allotment gardens that people purchased and then live in your apartment building, but you take the streetcar to your local community garden, although it's owned. And always enjoyed that when I went to visit relatives. So that's important. In my time as an educator, although my subject that I taught was physics, the reality is I always worked with students who were struggling, and probably the most rewarding part of my career was being responsible for adult education and adults who were struggling between careers, I was lucky that the board I was with also had employment services. So in the same office, you could earn credits, you could do ESL, you could participate in literacy and basic skills training, or get employment services. And often people needed all 3 or 4 of those. And seeing people move from struggling to thriving is hugely important to me. And I think that's why this project drew me. We have also run another garden for a number of years that we work with the school board with to provide a hands-on co-op experience where they're growing food, running it as a cooperative, running a market evening once a week or so to sell some of the produce. And I think that gives an opportunity for students who perhaps don't thrive in the traditional classroom or online summer school situation to have a hands-on activity and to feel accepted by their peers and have success. And that's, all those things together are what drive me.
Well, and just as an educator, I was interested at what you said about the classes that come in. And I know it's elementary, and I know you said you taught older, and adult learning is very important, but have the teachers made curriculum links to the garden, or is it really more the value of just the green space overall, or are they connecting it to real food security and ecological discussions? Do you know what the teachers are doing?
I don't know as well as I would like. I do know that some teachers certainly have made that connection. Something I forgot to point out in the video is that on the top right outside the fence, we have a fairly, and it's expanded since the video was taken, a pollinator garden that we have worked with the school. We provided the plants, they provided the person power to plant them and maintain them and so on, which helps in terms of curriculum connections. It also has a practical use in that it provides a buffer between the school and where the kids are and the fence. And, it was beautiful last fall. I'm sure it'll be even better this year because the plants were relatively new, and we're hoping to expand that. But even just having a kindergarten class come through with a supply teacher, as has happened, and I happen to be working there in the garden, point out here's this, here's that, and it's just wonderful because many of our kids have no idea where food comes from.
Yeah. All right, there's a question. Julie, please feel free to ask your question.
Hi there. That was a great talk. I come from around Guelph, and it's great to hear things like this are happening. I've moved to Kingston now. I was excited to hear that you were talking about a pollinator garden, and I'm curious to know if they are perennials.
Yes, we've planted only perennials. We got some funding from Pollination Guelph to purchase some plants, and the City of Guelph provides a tray or 2 of pollinators, native species, to any community garden who wishes to plant them. So we have been relying on that as well. What we're looking at roughly now, I think, is we have approximately, I want to say close to 100 feet of garden, roughly 5 feet deep. I apologize, working in imperial measurements, but that is what we have. We need native species because we don't have the person power to both fill tanks and water those plants. So it is fairly labor intensive. So we need something that can thrive in a relatively dry environment, but what we have there has done really well. Now, a couple classes did plant a few sunflowers. We had some, oh, I can't remember what it's called, purple tall plant that has little seeds at the top. It'll come to me.
Ironweed?
No, it's used for food as well. It'll come to me. It's self-seeded there as well. So from one of the gardens, but by tall, I mean 6 feet tall or so. Oh, sorry, it's not coming to me right now.
That's okay. One of the things I learned about in the last year was winter sowing. And I've sown a number of native plants. They're just wee seedlings at the moment, but I wondered if winter sowing was something that you might try to do in the winter, like in January, or the preparation in the fall. as people are winding down their gardens to get them excited earlier in the year for gardening?
At this point, in terms of our gardeners who have the plots, getting them excited is not an issue. We are struggling to keep them out until we have things cleaned up and so on. There's a bit of prep work to be done after a long winter, and doing assignments of plots as people come and go, and we try and get our wait list down. So there's that. We have tried a couple of cover crops without a whole lot of luck, but I think that depends a whole lot on what we're planting and when we're planting, but we'll continue to work at that to try and keep weeds down in the late fall and early spring.
Oh, it sounds like a great program. Thanks for working on that.
Welcome, thank you.
So another question that I had, and that is, given that all these families have plots, and are there any restrictions of when people can come? Is there a time where you've seen it? Like, how busy has it become as a social place? It's one of those third places, it's in the public realm, and it's a place where people can gather. So I was just wondering, how full does it become sometimes?
That depends a whole lot on time of day and time of year. In the late spring, before the big summer heat hit, you could count on probably 25 to 30 people being there in the early evening hours, like from 7 o'clock till 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock till dusk, basically. Because those who work are available after supper, and it has cooled down a bit. It is not the scorching heat, and that's when, for the most part, people come. We have a gentleman who lives across the street who is currently not working, who we have hired part-time to come at, probably starts at 5:30 in the morning, puts out the 250 feet of hose and fills the tank so that by 7 o'clock they're ready. When I walk the dog and walk by, there's nobody there in the morning. It's relatively empty. Again, depends. During planting time, it was much busier all day long for a period of time, but those evenings were really social events. We have a number of different cultures. We have a number of Arabic families that would come as a group, and then after that, take the kids off to the neighborhood playground. So it was busy, and I think we did a survey in 2021 at the end of our first season, when about half the garden was there. And the most important thing that people mentioned was not growing of food, it was the social connections. And part of that is coming out of COVID.
Yeah. Are there embedded educational opportunities as well, like very specific things about organic gardening, about are people learning from each other about growing different types of crops? As you say, sometimes, there's a lot of just basic gardening information, but also lots of interesting ways to look at gardens. And do people share and offer sort of workshops informally or formally?
Absolutely, people share. Having people come from different cultures, talk to some families who were collecting what's it called, lamb's
Ears.
I think lamb's ears, and saying that, I put this in my salad and so on, and other people are pulling it and throwing it up. And then just having those sorts of conversations as to what different people value in terms of food is important. We have worked closely with, my mind is mush today for some reason, with Ignatius College, which has probably the largest community garden in the City of Guelph, large organic farm and so on. We have hired a gentleman from there in the past. We have certainly had their staff come out and run workshops for us on weekends. We call it Ask a Farmer, so that people could ask, why is my lettuce not growing well, or what kind of bugs are these and what can I do about it, and so on. So we've had those sorts of things. We are intentionally running some guides to planting early in May, so that we don't end up with 15 tomato plants 6 inches apart and then frustration over things. We noticed very early our first year that People knew enough to stake their tomatoes, but didn't know enough to pinch them off and to tie them to those stakes. Hadn't looked closely enough at that. So we know that there's a lot of work to be done. Many of our gardeners are not new to gardening, but new to gardening in Canada. So different kinds of plants, different kinds of climate. So there's a lot of learning going on, but yes, people are certainly learning from each other, and we're putting as many of those learning opportunities as possible in. We had hired a garden coordinator last year in February, but unfortunately due to family issues, she had to move out of the area by April, and we were left with being unable to hire anybody with a strong background in organic gardening. So we did our best, but we will continue to get better.
Thank you, Joan. Joan said it was lamb's quarters. So
Lamb's quarters, thank you.
yes, like mild spinach.
Yep. Yes.
Very nice. All right. Well, one other thing I'm curious about, and that is because Soul, we're meeting people from across the country and learning about these places in different towns and cities. And we know that there are quite a few interesting things happening in Guelph. Like there are a number of these sites that are part of Soul's recognition program that have met the criteria to be recognized by Soul for the work that they do. And so can you just talk a little bit about the context of Guelph and whether or not you see it as a progressive place for these types of community initiatives? Is there a lot of support from, say, the city or the population in Guelph? You have a school partnership and Pollination Guelph as well. Can you just speak to the context of Guelph for everybody who's interested to know?
I can try, and it'll be from my point of view as opposed to perhaps somebody else's point of view. We were the first community garden on Catholic school board property. I worked in the public system, and I'm a trustee in the public system, so there's certainly not that connection. The public school system has a number of community gardens, but it depends on the size and availability of land. The reality is that schools are there for students first. And if there is a piece of land that is available and suitable for gardening and so on, I think the school boards are happy to make that available, provided that there's some sort of commitment to maintain the property and those sorts of things. One of the things that I think is important is this community garden network. There is a city staff member whose role it is to make sure communication happens between the gardens. And there are 30 some odd community gardens, I believe. Might be a little bit bigger or smaller, but we also during the growing season meet either in person or virtually once a month to share what's happening, to share stories and so on. Gardens that happen on city property, and as new parks are being built and so on, they're built with community gardens in mind in terms of access to water and various other things, but a lot of Guelph predates that. So I think there is an intentionality from the city there. I'm not sure how this community garden movement got started. Ignatius College is a big part of it, Ignatius Farm. But I know that there was a group with the Guelph, Dufferin, Wellington Public Health Unit that was behind community gardens back maybe 10 years ago. I'm not sure that is still the case. But certainly there is the demand, and I think when people see them, they want a community garden in their neighborhood as well. So I think some of it is, let's call it inertia, but once you have something going, that it tends to grow as opposed to peter out. I know I've talked to people in Orangeville who are struggling to get community gardens going there, partly because there is no, and it's not really infrastructure, but even just that ability to communicate together and have that coordinated by somebody. There's not a huge amount of time, but it is something. I think that's important. Beyond that, we don't get, as a neighborhood group, I'm not, I can't tell you the exact amounts or so, but we don't get a lot of funding from the city at all. I think last year was something like $3,000. I might be mistaken. And keep in mind that we run recreation programs every night of the week. We have a food bank with a staff member who has that open 2 days a week. So we do a lot in the neighborhood, not a lot of financial support from the city, but being registered as a charity means that we have a lot of other funding opportunities through grants and so on that perhaps other groups don't have access to.
Well, okay, thank you so much for this whole presentation, for your perspective, for being with us today. I want to thank everybody for joining us as well. So as I mentioned before, this presentation will be on Sol's website very soon. And there's a whole series happening this whole year and last year. So we've got lots of videos that people can go back to based on the theme or based on the location. And so I invite all of you to check it out. And again, I want to thank you for joining Sol today and for your interest in all the hard work that everybody has been doing in this field of ecological land care. So thank you very much.
Christine.
And everybody have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.